Hello. Some of you might remember this session. We did it last year, so I'm just sort of recapping this work. And I did this work with Anne Alkema. Okay, so we wanted to do an in-depth piece of work looking at the assessment tool's contribution to educational outcomes. Now, how we picked this... How about that? Yep. How we picked the sample, because we couldn't pick a sample on good embedding practice. It was quite difficult to, we don't have sort of the data to pick that easily. So what we did, we went to organisations that were high users of the assessment tool. We went to 9 different organisations. We went to a range of PTEs, ITPs and ITOs. We unfortunately didn't go to the one at that time because they couldn't participate in the research. Okay, so we spoke to 82 people. It was quite a major piece of work, and there was 2 parts to it. First of all, it was looking at how the information from the assessment tool is used to inform policy and practice, and then look at educational outcomes. So we couldn't really jump right to the impact on educational outcomes without understanding actually how is this information actually informing that teaching and practice. So I'm just going to go quickly through the high-level results. Overall, across the 9 organisations, there was a really clear, strong message that the assessment tool was being well used as a diagnostic, and tutors and program managers talked about, before the assessment tool, there were various ways that this was undertaken. This tool allowed for quick identification very early on in a program, so it was seen as a real beneficial tool to be using. So some of the key, I guess, positive of the assessment tool was that it informed deliberate acts of teaching and that enabled them to target specific areas of need. So I've used the example of the critical thinking element. So a number of tutors talked about, with the results of the assessment tool, they could see across the classroom, okay, maybe critical analysis was an area that they need to do more work on, and the assessment tool provided that information. It also helped to inform the placement of learners for peer support group, so potentially clustering of learners more around the sort of step levels that they came out on. And one thing that came across all of the organisations we went to was that it enabled the step 2 was seen as a bit of a signal that if learners came out at step 2 or below, it sort of signalled potentially additional extra support. The ITOs, now they have a different delivery model. It's vast across all of the ITOs, so I guess it's a challenging space to work in some respects, because they don't necessarily have that classroom environment. We went to 2 ITOs that were using the assessment tool in different ways. Now, there is a research report on this that will be on the web soon, which goes into more of the detail. But essentially, it was similar to the non-ITOs in that been able to see the different steps. If a learner came up more at the higher level, it was sort of indicating that they potentially would be okay with the self-directed learning. More in the middle area, it was seen, well, potentially there are other sort of resources like pathways that the learner could be directed to. And again, like the other organisations, step 2 and below, it was signal that actually we needed to look at additional support. And another area that one ITO in particular talked about was that looking across all of the results across the whole, I guess, cohort, they could sort of look at patterns or look at areas of need. So, for example, one ITO talked about how ratios was seen as a common theme that was coming up as area of need. So then they sort of targeted their resources and training advisors in that space. Okay, so overall, the tutors, program managers talked about that there is a contribution factor, as a positive contribution factor, but the extent of it was difficult to ascertain. And similar for the learners we spoke to, there was a sense that this is a good thing. They could articulate, we had numerous examples of learners articulating their numeracy and literacy gaps and strengths. And this is a great example. Actually, this whole PTE used pathways really integrated into their practice, and they'll be talking today in the second day. Okay, so the other contributing variables that was discussed was that the embedding practice is really important. It's not the tool itself, but it's how the tool is used in practice. The type of training and the length of course was discussed at great length. Some of the longer term courses where you had actually a chance to do the diagnostic and actually embed numeracy and literacy practices was seen as potentially better than the shorter courses. And learner characteristics such as age, motivation and ability was also seen as variables that could contribute or not to better learner outcomes. And this, just to finish, this was a quote by an educator that sort of just emphasises that it's not the tool per se, it's how the tool is used within the whole embedding practice. So that's where the work was at the end of last year. It left a lot of questions, and at the end of the day, like qualitative work, it was really in depth, but we only went to 9. So it's how do we build more of the quantitative element into this piece of research? So the intent was to look at developing some statistical model that could look at the range of variables that is possible within the big data set, like age, ethnicity, the organisation. So it was a joint piece of work between TEC and MOE. We were both working in the space, so it was really good to do this collaboration. And we contracted BERL to undertake the statistical modelling. So this is what Ganesh is going to talk about now. Yep.
Thank you, Kathryn. Kia ora tātou. Being a born and bred Wellingtonian, welcome you all to my hometown. It's been a bit of a painful return to this particular venue. But to all the Highlanders in the audience, well done. It was a well-deserved victory. I just hope that as a born and bred Wellingtonian, I don't have to wait for another 20 years. Right. What the task in front of us here, the literacy and numeracy assessment tool, and I'll be honest with you, this is way outside my comfort zone. I'm not an educator. My only experience about education is, of course, having been through the education system, but that was a long time ago. I think it's changed, although I do have peripheral knowledge, having been a parent of 2 children who've gone through a fair bit of it, and in my downtime I do for my sins chair a board of trustees for the local high school. So I'm going to talk to, not TEC, but I'm going to talk to the Ministry about funding things a bit later. When the proposal came, or the request for proposal came across our desk at BERL, and had a reasonably good look at it, BERL in our other consultancy work are engaged with many polytechs in the sector and many ITOs, and have done work for TEC in the past. So we know the education sector primarily in the context of developing skills for the workforce. We know the importance, we know the work that's done there, but we don't, I suppose in terms of this sort of nitty-gritty at the coalface stuff that's a little bit outside our comfort zone. We had a look at it and it says, okay, the use of the tool, does it impact on student outcomes? And from the outside, as a bunch of economists, we were a little bit sceptical. I personally was a little bit cynical. How using a diagnostic tool can make any difference to student outcomes doesn't make any sense to me. It's, as Kathryn has said quite early on, it's how the tool is used that's more important than whether it is used or not. How it's used and how it's used to inform or change your behaviour, change the behaviour of tutors and or learners. That's the critical thing. But quite happy to give this a go to see, just from a purely numerical sense, does it make a difference? Openly acknowledging that if we do find it makes, we do find from a numerical sense that it does make a difference, then there's got to be some underlying behaviour change that backs up that numerical conclusion. Otherwise, it is just playing with a whole set of numbers. And of course, I love playing with numbers, which is fine by me. But it's got to have some foundation. And so that's backed up by Kathryn and her team's research around the way the tool is used. What we want to look at is, or what we were tasked with looking at is there some numerical relationship that we could quantify that would enable us to justify ongoing use of the tool, and indeed maybe even target the tool a little bit more in terms of which groups and so on. So that's our task. The first particular issue was around what sort of data set we could use, and we didn't have to worry about that because that was given to us. We were focusing on the Youth Guarantee data set over the years 2010 to 2013. So that's the guts of it in terms of the foundations. Well, hopefully that's not going to work. If I just press that, that'll work. The first problem that we faced with, and openly it wasn't clear to me, how do you define student performance? Because that's what we want to explain, and obviously you have different definitions of student performance in your own world, but from a quantitative analysis or from a numbers person, we need a number. How do you define student performance? Is it A or B? Is it 1 or 50 or is it 100? And so after a little bit of discussion and a little bit of toing and froing, in terms of what was available on the data set, settled on the equation or the expression that's in front of you, the number of courses completed divided by the number of courses that the person was enrolled in. Each of them, or both items, F's weighted, so we got a full-time equivalent measure of that. And that variable that we're going to try and explain ranges from 0 to 1. So if they scored 0, that means they completed absolutely none of their courses. If they scored 1, they completed all of their courses. If they scored 0.5, they completed half of their courses. Okay, so that's the variable that we were trying to explain. And in particular, we were trying to say, well, how is that variable, or is that variable in some part explained by whether the individual used the tool or not, or whether the tool was being used in that individual's course provision. So that's the guts of it, and we can argue about whether that's an appropriate measure of student performance or not, but it's a starting point. How does that look in our data set, that dependent variable, or that variable that we're trying to explain? And this is so what we plotted was the 14,500 observations that we had, or nearly 14,500 observations of individual students in the Youth Guarantee program over the 4 years, 2010 to 2013. And that picture there describes what the data set that we were faced with, that we were trying to explain. So that's our proxy, if you like, for student performance. And it looks like that, which is a little bit unsettling for me as a statistician, because I'm going to see that's going to be difficult to explain, let alone anything to do with use of the tool. So what we did was we split the project up beforehand, because we didn't want to spend all of TEC's money all at once. So we said, we'll just have a quick look at this and let you know if it's worthwhile going any further, because as I said, we were relatively cynical, so we could have spent all of the budget and then come back and told you it was not worth your while. But we said, let's just have a quick look at it to start with, and then if we think it's worthwhile, we'll come back for another bite at the pie and use up the rest of the budget. So that's where we look. So in terms of the quick look, which wasn't using any great numerical techniques other than let's just draw some pictures, and so we split that 14,500 into the group that used the tool and the group that didn't use the tool. And this is a picture for the group that used the tool. Okay, so imprint that picture on your mind. And here's the other picture for the group that didn't use the tool. Okay, and that meant, okay, I will park my cynicism to one corner and say and admit, yes, there's probably something in here that's worthwhile looking at. Okay, for those just putting those pictures on the same slide, or slicing out some of the intermediate ones that were a little bit difficult, but what you've got on the left-hand side of that picture is, what have we got? The comparison of the people who scored low in terms of course completion, towards the zero end of that spectrum, and what you have is, both of the vertical axes are percentages. Okay, what you have is a relatively low percentage in terms of the group that used the tool and a relatively higher percentage in terms of the group that didn't use the tool. And on the right-hand side, you've got the observations that were towards the fully completed course performance or course student performance. And again, you've got the reverse, a higher percentage in terms of completions for those who used the tool versus those who didn't use the tool. So that's just from pictures. And for those who don't like those pictures, here's the same data in a different set of pictures. I find this a lot simpler to look at. Okay, couple of pies there. For those who use the tool on the left-hand side, for those who didn't use the tool on the right-hand side. The green slice are those who fully completed, that is scored a 1 on my dependent variable. The red slice of the pie, those who completed none, that was 0 on my dependent variable, and the black slice of the pie, those in between 0 and 1. For those who were a little bit concerned earlier on, we did remove the observations of those students who withdrew relatively early in the program. So we have taken away those ones who withdrew. So the ones who scored 0 are indeed those ones who saw through a fair proportion of the program, if not towards the end, but managed to score 0 still at the end. So we have, I believe, and I'll take David's gospel on this, because he's the one who sent us the data, they've extracted out those ones who withdrew from courses relatively early in the scheme. So we've extracted as much out of that as possible, so we're not catching spurious observations here. This is the 14,500 cohort that did go through the Youth Guarantee program over the 2010 to 2013 period, and those two pictures up there suggest to me that using the tool is having an influence somehow. So what we wanted to do then and say, well, we go back, yes, it's probably worthwhile having a look at this in a little bit more detail, and maybe putting some numbers on it. So go back to my original picture, which is the brown bars in there. So we've got 14,500, and the blue picture is, for any statisticians in the room, running a simple regression or running a simple equation, throwing a whole lot of variables at it and asking the blue bars to explain the brown bars, and you can say it didn't work very well, okay? You don't need to be a statistician to see those blue bars do not match the brown bars very well. So, and for those statisticians in the audience, you shouldn't be surprised. A picture that looks like the brown bars causes a lot of strife and a lot of difficulty. For ordinary standard regression techniques. So we needed to be a little bit more, I won't say clever, but a little bit more sophisticated than just looking at the simple stage 1 statistical models that we have. So we didn't quite throw everything away. What we decided to do was, because we looked at that original spectrum of brown bars, and we said, well, it's actually, what are the ones that we're most interested in? So we actually split the data set into 2 different data sets or sub-data sets, subgroups. We looked at the ones that scored 0 and or 1. So not all. So this is the ones who scored 0 and those that scored 1. And that was about 9,000, what have I got up there? And more than 9,000 of that 14,500 observations. So it's a sizable bulk of that data set. And we said, that's the 0s and the 1s. And those, by eye, we could see are quite large. And those are the ones where there are differences that we wanted to have a look at. And we looked at those, and we parked for the moment those ones in between. But we put them in, not quite in the too hard basket, but we parked them, and we were going to look at them. We called them the partial completions. We're going to look at them separately, and I'll come back to them in a little while. So we were going to, in the first instance, take you to that 9,000 observations in terms of individual students who either completed 0 or scored 0, that is completed none, or scored 1, that is completed all of them, and looked at, oops, I've turned over too many pages, one more slide, and look at how does use of that assessment tool influence whether they were a 0 or a 1. From a technical perspective, we used a logic model for those who may or may not be interested in numbers. A dependent variable in the previous exercise, we were trying to work out the number, whereabouts between 0 and 1 the individual student was going to lie, and we were trying to work an equation that worked out whereabouts between 0 and 1 they were going to lie, and we weren't successful. So now a logic model, all this does is works out the probability that the student is going to fall in the 1 basket as opposed to the probability they'll be a 0. So it's a different technique. So we're looking at a dependent variable that can only take on 2 values, either a 0 or a 1, and we're looking at the probability that our selected observation would be a 1. And we're looking at, does that probability change if they use the tool or not? Okay, so that's the technique that we're thinking. We've got a probability. Does that probability change, get higher or lower, if they use the tool or not? We want to control for a few other variables. So we looked at we introduced year of completion, whether it was 2010 or 2013, or ones in between. We also captured ethnicity, self-identified according to the MOE data that comes through. We looked at 3 groups, Euro, Māori and Pacifica, and clearly an individual can be in more than one of those groups. We looked at provider type, polytechnic, wānanga and other, where other included PTEs, and also field of study, where we stayed at the NZ Statistical Classification of Education, whatever. What's the D stand for? Anyway, NZ the field of study. And so we looked at those. There were a few other things that we looked at as well, but they didn't come out as very interesting. The headline, so we threw them away. Statistically not very interesting, so we threw them away, okay? I'm sure they were interesting for you. Headline result, and I didn't quite fall off my chair here, but I'm sort of getting back on my chair, and I needed some convincing that this was correct, so I redid the numbers myself as opposed to my team. I do trust my team, but I wanted to check it myself as well. The headline result, depending upon what, and I'll go through this picture, depending upon the different brown bars depends on which of those other influences you throw into the equation. The vertical axis is the percentage point difference in probability that using the tool makes. And they're all above 0, so using the tool has a positive influence. It improves your probability of being 1, and indeed improves the probability by quite a statistically significant amount. It's at about the 30 to 35%. So for example, if you had a probability that you were about sort of 50% going to succeed, if you use the tool, that probability would go up to about 80 or 85%. Okay? That's how you interpret it. And it's relatively consistent irrespective of what other variables we threw at it. Okay? So that's fairly strong evidence, given the data set we've got in terms of the Youth Guarantee Program, that using the tool has an influence to the positive in terms of the student outcome. Just picking up a little bit further, this to me is probably the most interesting slide or interesting finding. We looked at, okay, the blue bar is the overall average. It has an impact, having thrown all of the variables at the equation and taken out the ones that were not significant, statistically significant. The blue bar, 36% improvement in probability if you use the tool. Okay, improvement in probability of course completion, full course completion. But it's a little bit different for some of the subgroups, but still significant. Still significantly positive. For the 2010 cohort, it wasn't as big as 36%, so less than 30%. And that goes with what I was told by the TEC group, that in the early days of the tool wasn't used as widely and wasn't used as a feeding into changing teaching practices. It was used more as a compliance, or seen as more of a compliance thing. So that may or may not. The 2010 group was actually also a relatively smaller sample, so not surprising that it came out different. For Māori students, makes a significantly larger difference than the overall average. I'm not an educationalist, so I don't know how to interpret it, but it's a finding that hopefully I'll leave you to think about and whether it makes sense or not, and also how you use that in your future practices. For Pacifica students, slightly less than the overall average, but it still comes up as significant, so I've got to put it on the graph. For Wānanga, noticeably less than the overall average. The one proviso I'll put next to the Wānanga is the Wānanga cohort is very small in the overall sample that we've got. But it still comes up as statistically significant. But again, so I throw it in there, again, a question mark about how to interpret it. In terms of course field of study, the two fields of study, three fields of study that came out as significant apart from all the others. For engineering and mixed field courses, and this is at the broad NZ SCED level, so there's about 12 at that level. The three that come out as significantly different from the overall 36%. The use of the tool makes a bigger impact on those in engineering and mixed field, and engineering includes the motor vehicle, motor car mechanic, that technical stuff. I'm sure you know all about that. For management and commerce field of study, and that it will include the tourism element, 28%, so that's a little bit less. So there's a few, I won't say ifs and buts, but there's a few interesting things inside the picture. But the overall picture, a plus. They're all, in all of these groups and all of these subgroups, the assessment tool makes a positive difference to the probability of the individual succeeding, if you like to use that word, or completing. The reason, if you don't know already, the reason we didn't put age into the group is because this data set only has 16 and 17 year olds in the data set, so it didn't make much sense to throw age into it. But clearly, one would think that age might make an impact or might make a difference for a much broader data set, which we can talk about a bit later. For the statisticians in the audience, or for those who just want to know whether this actually does make any sense, the one piece of rigour that I'll throw in you, I don't have a picture in front because it doesn't go into pictures the way the statistics work, but if I put the equation in, it successfully, the equation that we've got that was in the previous slide, it will successfully predict 78% of the data set. Okay, so that's a fairly good number from my perspective. Anything above 55 or 60% is pretty good from most econometric techniques. So this correctly predicts 78%, so that's not too bad. And the words are there, which is just basically saying what I said before in terms of the slide. In terms of the partial course completions, this is what it looks like. Well, these are the other 5,000 in the data set, or 5,400. What we're trying to explain is a picture that looks like that. We threw a whole lot of variables at it. We tried a couple of other techniques, but without taking up too much of your time, we'll just put a black line through it. It's not quite yet in the too hard basket, but probably we decided probably not worth, at least at this initial stage, going too much further into this area. Last comments. Yes, we've established a positive influence, a significant influence, statistically significant, so that's good, and the equation seems to be reasonably good that we can take it further. The second bullet point is my big question that I feel a knife going through the shoulder blades, a little bit of a concern from my perspective. Is this conclusion, or how transferable is this conclusion from the Youth Guarantee data set towards other data sets or other observations in the tertiary education sector? And I suppose that's the next step that I would dearly love to get into, because I just love playing with numbers, but I think is also, from a policy perspective and from an implementation perspective, a critical question that we need to ask. And I suppose that's also the second question. Does the numbers actually back up the way the tool is being used? Is there actually qualitative data or changes in teaching practice that would back up the numbers perspective that, yes, using the tool is important? And take on board Kathryn's and her team's research that has been done before. Obviously needs to be further, all of this exercise needs to be further reinforced by ongoing studies to make sure that the tool is not only being monitored, but its use is being further integrated. The one question, the last bullet point, question mark about, are we putting more and more compliance, if you like, or more and more load on either the student and or the provider? I suppose that's something for others to worry about, or not worry about, but we have to maintain that sort of balance. Last, my final comments. In terms of what we could do next, we could go and spend a lot more time trying to explain that partial completions data set. I've got a few options in there, but I'll leave that for you to think about as to whether that's more important. I've already said in terms of my line in the sand, I think what's far more important is the youth guarantee data is one. Some might say peculiar characteristics of that data set. Is the same model going to apply for other data sets? And then also let's be a little bit more, so we could be a little bit more sophisticated and look at not just use of the tool, but whether how the tool is being used in terms of number of assessments and whether it's reading or whether it's literacy or numeracy and those sorts of things. We could bring into the equation, and or whether we could link it, and we've got the data and we did a little bit of pre-linking but it didn't quite work, but it might be useful for outside youth guarantee when you go beyond the 16 and 17 year olds to look at their school engagement record and whether using the tool has made any difference depending on different characteristics. And then of course lastly, we've got 2014 data, so we might as well throw that in as well. My last underlying comment, if we do go down any of these routes, which I would obviously recommend or advise, the fundamental number one thing that we have to do is make sure the data continues to be collected. The data has to be robust so that we can actually use the data for not just quantitative but also qualitative research. Thank you.
Return key. Okay. Ooh. Right. That's better. Right, technology right. So just summing up on that, the qualitative research that Kathryn presented showed that the tool is valuable as part of embedding. It's not something, can't just stick people on the machine and say go for it and forget about it, as I think everyone in this room would appreciate. It is part of a bigger package of stuff going on. And we did look at, so we wanted to get the quantitative evidence. We looked at a specific context, which is youth guarantee, which is aimed at school leavers with low achievement. The initial modelling does suggest this very significant association between tool use and course success. Like Ganesh, I have to say, I went away, particularly after we presented this to TC and had some comments and thought, I need to run the models myself. I don't quite believe, I'm not quite able to believe that this result is as robust as it looks to be. But actually having played around with the data again, there are competing explanations about what this might be, but they don't stand up very well when you test them in the data. So some of it is probably that some people who have a lower chance of completing the course escape the assessment. But when you roughly plug in school characteristics and school experience, it reduces the tool use impact a little bit, but not a lot. Similarly, it might be that the providers who use the tool really well with all of their students are the really good providers, but we've seen it really consistent across the 3 years, 2011 to 2013, and we've changed a hell of a lot in terms of the mix of providers in there. So there's something more than these other explanations going on. So the next thing we need to do is actually refine more of the models, make sure that we can exclude other explanations formally using modelling, but then also have more discussion about what is it that we're picking up. So it is bigger than just the use of the tool. And as Ganesh says, we do need to test this in other programs. It might be something about the Youth Guarantee program and situation that it works really well. we want to go on and look at the level 1 and 2 for other age groups and see if there's if the same effect turns up or if different effects turn up. So next steps is refining the model, applying it to other funds and contexts. There is a thing called the integrated data infrastructure that Stats New Zealand operate, where all the government departments is basically a big depository of government data, which we can then get in and play with under very, very strict privacy conditions. But that gives us a chance to look at other outcomes. So maybe course completion is a little bit too circular in that there are things that go on within courses. It's maybe not the best way to measure outcomes. So we can go forward and look at, does it make a difference? Can we link up a story that goes into things like employability, income, other social outcomes that can be plugged into that? So it widens the range of things we can look at. So that's really, I think that's, so that's the end of our presentation. I think we have I think we can get 5 minutes looking at organisers. Couple of minutes for questions. So take a few questions and happy to talk to people over lunch as well.
Sorry, quick question, David. When we looked at the data, we had 14,000 learners. Are there individual learners? So if, for instance, one student had completed the assessment tool, the assessment 2 or 3 times, that person was considered only once in that data?
Yeah, they're considered only once. Okay, and if they were in youth guarantee over 2 different years, they're still just considered as one. So it was counting them by starting cohorts.
Hi, David. I'm just interested in how you defined use of the tool. Was it literacy or numeracy?
We haven't gone very, very simply. Was there an assessment record for that student that we could associate to youth guarantee using the rules that TUC have set up? So it's definitely something we want to look for more into is literacy and numeracy. Do those kind of have different impacts or not?
Kia ora, I'm wondering if after the Te Ata Hapara data starts coming in, whether that will be compared with the...
Yeah, so that's definitely something we should do. And I have to say the youth option isn't really covered by this because we only looked at people up to 213 and that started in 214, so that's more stuff to look at as well.
I'm actually quite impressed that it has come out that it is good because I think the people working with it see the good that it does. Even for a lot of my students in Youth Guarantee, their belief that they will never get anywhere with anything, often doing this at the start of their course, they see that they're not as incapable as they believe, and that actually encourages them to engage more with their learning. However, I just sort of thought maybe the idea of just looking at course completion, there's so many that engage with Youth Guarantee that have a myriad of other social problems going on that don't necessarily complete, but definitely come out with improved literacy and numeracy skills. And I still think the tool does a lot of good with a lot of people that you're not capturing.
No, that's good to hear, and certainly would acknowledge course completion's a fairly limited measure to be using. It's the one we've got consistently for everyone, so that's why we've used it.
Hi, I'm just wondering if actually putting a leveller across the course completions would make the data a bit more robust and valid, because, for instance, some of us are enrolling students into 120 credits, some of us are enrolling students into only 60, lower, and there's all such a variety amongst that spectrum. And often, we're getting advice from TEC to say you might even like to consider only enrolling students as they complete a course, to improve our statistics and things. So I'm just wondering, do we need to be looking at something like that to be able to get the data a bit more valid? Because I'm wondering if that is skewing the data.
Well, my understanding is that they are Fs weighted, so I'm not sure how much difference that would make, but I think the definition of course completions is something that we grapple with, and whether it is representing what we want to measure. So I know I'm not embedded with that measure, but it's a starting point. And once we're made aware of these potential pitfalls, we can modify that variable, I would think, depending if the data's available.
And in a very rough way, the fact that we put the whether they're in a polytechnic, wānanga or PTE, was a little bit of that levelling. So the low result, when I dug into my kind of version of the model and looked at wānanga, the low result for wānanga is because that small group actually had very high completion rates compared to everyone else. So there wasn't actually a lot of room for the tool to add more to them. So there's a little bit of that, but you need to go into much more sophisticated modelling to get rid of all of that or deal with all of it.